Hello everyone, and once again welcome to my channel Economics Unplugged with Praful Raj. My channel is about the insightful conversation with professors and economists about the Indian and the global economy. Today our special guest is Mr. Dhananjay Sinha, who is currently working in a systematic group. He has more than 25 years of experience working in the industry in research and various analysis. He has also served as a chief economist at JM Financials. So, today we will talk about one of the most important topics of development economics, that is poverty in India. Thank you so much, Dhananjay sir, for joining my podcast, Economics Unplugged with Praful Raj. So, as we today we'll be talking about poverty in India, the calculation and what is exactly the poverty rate in last 5 years and 10 years. So different agencies and experts talk about the poverty in a different percentage. For example, the as per the National and Family Health Survey, the percentage of population living in poverty fell to 15% in 19 to 21 from 25% in 2015 to 2016. Then the second, as per the Panagiria and More research, there is a 26.9% of poverty in 2023 as per the periodic labor force survey data. Then we have recently released by National Multi-Dimensional Poverty Index, which is a progressive review of 2023, which says that 24.85% poverty was in 2015-16, which is reduced to 14.96 in 2019 to 21. So the question is that different agencies and different experts estimate, widely varying poverty rates for India. But irrespective of data sources, methodologies, if someone is deprived of basic necessity, should they not be considered poor irrespective? So how, like, what's the issue, or how we can reconcile these estimates, or what's the idea and the behind this?
So I think this is a massively confusing subject in India. I think this is emanating from the fact that you had the consumption expenditure survey last time that it had happened was in 2011-12, and after that there was another one that happened in 2017-18, which was actually dismissed by the government. So we don't have the data after the last survey that was almost like more than a decade back. So I think what the consumer expenditure survey gives us is what is happening to the expenditure level, the income level of households across India, across segments, across socio-economic background, rural, urban, a lot of slicing and dicing one can do. And based on that, one can actually assess so what is the kind of deprivation of poverty that the Indian society is facing. And the point is that since the government had actually dismissed the next survey, which was 2017-18, we do not know what is really happening. So recently, the government has said that they would actually reconsider the way the survey is done. So they started doing the survey in a new format, which is supposed to be a reformed format in 2022-23, and then another one in 2023-24. So the survey, the last survey for FY23 has already been done, and the government has said that, or the agencies have said that it will be published in December.
Yeah.
But it appears that the government would actually it will be published along with the 2023-24 survey, which is like it will still be about 12 to 18 months time from now. So it will be well into next year. Towards end of 2024 is when we get the latest data. So you have a significant gap in which with which you get the household survey, and we do not know what is happening. The critical issue here is that people have utilized the 2011-12 survey. Some people have actually extrapolated based on national income data, the pattern of the distribution that time, and tried to come up with some kind of data. And some claim that there is a considerable reduction in poverty. Some people have said that there has been a absolute reduction, or the poverty has been completely eradicated, etc.
Educated.
So the point is that, so the latest the data that has been published by the National Multidimensional Poverty Index has been published by the Niti Aayog, which claims that about 134 million people have been lifted out of poverty over the last 7 years or so. These are the data that is there. But the point is this, that while there are multiple authors who have come up with multiple estimates claiming that that poverty reduction has happened, a lot of people have actually also challenged those estimates, based on methodology, etc. And there are equally compelling analysis which shows that there is an increase in poverty based on various methods that people have utilized. My sense is that if poverty really has been reduced, as the government claims or government agencies claim, such as Niti Aayog is claiming, then it should be seen to be happening. The thing is that you need to really look at whether there has been. I mean, there are signs to indicate that the poverty has been reduced. So, which means the prosperity level of people must have increased, the livelihood conditions of people would have actually improved. But if you look at the data, data from multiple sectors are pointing to the contrary, which is basically that you have unemployment level persisting for last almost like a decade or so. We know that if the economy has to transform from a productive economy to a from an unproductive economy to a prosperous economy, the productive sector need to be growing rapidly. There has to be increasing investments, and as investments happen, you draw people into productive employment, and prosperity, etc. happens. That surely hasn't happened, given the context that you have unemployment which has persisted for more than a decade. Then you have corporate investments not happening.
Yes.
That is another thing. So there are multiple things. I calculated an implied income growth for household in real terms, and based on the household national income data. If you look at the private consumption expenditure and add the savings of the household, you get a sense of what is the income growth, and that in real terms have actually fallen to 3.5%, which is, I would say, the lowest in 30 years. So clearly, some of these data and some of these indicators don't really add up to justify claims that there is a decrease in poverty rate, and the fact that the government has to really scale up Manrega, which is up 44% since pre-COVID, and the fact that you have to distribute food grains to people almost like uh, 800 and something, 810 million people are provided free food. I think those are symptoms to suggest that such claims are are maybe misplaced actually.
Yeah, so we will talk about private investment, Manrega, but before that, first that Niti Aayog, the estimate of multi-dimensional poverty was from UNDP. Yeah, Niti Aayog reposted it probably. And yes, you mentioned about that we have the survey has not been done, and there are different approaches: consumption-based approach, then the employment, unemployment approach. So why do you think? Very first question: why do you think we have the survey has not done been in last 10 years, more than a decade? Like what could be the possible reason, like if you think
Right.
a perspective?
So first of all, this I would want to address the one point that you had mentioned about the national
Yeah.
multi-dimensional poverty indicator that Niti Aayog has actually published. It is actually a modified version of what the UN
PP
what UN has actually published. So UN has 10 indicators within
indicators.
the multi-dimensional index. The Niti Aayog has added two more. So basically, there are 12 indicators that Niti Aayog has used. One additional thing is about the health dimension, indicator, wherein they have actually included the women who are, pregnant women who have access to professional delivery system, etc. and number two, they have included also in the well-being of the of household the access to banking accounts, etc. So
But
what it does is to so since 80-90% of the women have access to public health care and they have access to a formal delivery system during the pregnancy, post the pregnancy, it sort of excludes a lot of people outside of
yes,
deprivation
deprivation.
of deprivation. And also that now that for any basic public direct benefit scheme that the government has, you need to have a sort of bank account, etc. So you have a significant increase in number of people who have access to saving bank account of banks or post offices, etc. So that doesn't necessarily sort of mean that people have actually moved out of poverty, because it's a necessity that people need to have that to get the direct benefit scheme. So I think there are a lot of exclusion in the big exclusion that is there in the multi-dimensional indicator that the Niti Aayog has actually published, and also that it actually excludes the age group of 6 to 18 years of children in the entire estimation. That also creates a lot of exclusion. Coming to your question about why it has not been published, the earlier why is there such a gap in the survey? I would say that the survey that happened for during the year 2017-18, the government said that it is inconsistent with the reality. They questioned the methodology, the sanctity of the finding, etc. But if you look at what the media reports were publishing at that point of time, it showed that the per capita expenditure, monthly expenditure of households actually decreased
Yes.
lower quartile of the whole household segmentation. And I remember that it also told that there is a sort of increase in poverty level. So I guess the results were not very palatable. I would say, and of course the government had doubts about consistency, etc. So I think it was rejected and it was never published. So there were initial media reports on it, but the government now is saying that we will have another survey which will have a better methodology. You will do three rounds of interviews during the survey to come up with a more robust outcome. We'll see what it entails and what does it break out. So we'll need to wait for that, and I think it will be much beyond the next year general election that is scheduled in 2024. So it will be much later. I guess it will be somewhere around December when you get to know.
Yeah, December 24. So as you mentioned, one last question on poverty, like Niti Aayog added this about the banking system, like how many people have access to bank. But isn't thing like poverty is not about that. For example, the World Bank calculates the poverty line of $1.9 per day earnings, like 160 rupees in terms of India. And UNDP has already considered a 10 factors, which actually tells like whether you are deprived, like nutrition, child mortality, years of schooling, sanitization, cooking fuel. So Niti Aayog being adding those parameters probably does not, of course it will reduce the number because the number of people access to banking has increased, but probably they have not talked about the dormant accounts also. It's not just opening an account. So before commenting and all, probably we need to we'll wait till 2024 and what is the new survey says. So
Yeah, I think, see, the thing is very clear that, see what has happened in this over the last, I would say, almost like a decade, and more so because of multiple shocks that the economy has gone through demonetization, trade protectionism, I would say, the banking crisis, non-banking crisis, etc., and the lockdown, etc. There are multiple shocks that has happened, and I think what has happened is the formal sector has gained through gain market share from the informal sector, and the informal sector has been a major source of employment. And that, as you know, concentration of market power has actually been detrimental with respect to the income generation, employment situation, etc. So I think we may come up with various concepts and estimation methods of estimation and all. But if you look at some basic stuff, if you look at how much people are consuming, for instance, if you look at the IIP data, there is a segment which is akin to the FMCG companies. It's basic things such as food items, such as basic soaps, detergents, those kind of stuff. If you look at that, I mean, if you look at the IIP data, that component is actually contracting. Whereas if you look at formal companies such as HUL, which is a major staple company, so you're talking about essential items. Now, HUL volume growth has come down to 3%. 10 years back, they used to grow at 6.5%, when they had much lower market share, which means the informal sector was growing had a much bigger pie. So I
Right.
think some of indicators, if you look at it, notwithstanding whatever methodology you're using, it is all showing up. And more people, because of the lack of investments, more and more people are drifting into rural areas, relying more on agriculture sector, which is a low paying, low productivity sector. So I think it's a reversal that is happening. I think these things are very glaring, and I mean, before you claim that poverty has been eradicated, you should consider all these data
All these
points.
factors. Now coming back to this some of the poverty elevation scheme that is introduced by Government of India, for example, Manrega, National Food Security Act, and we have like Pradhan Mantri Gramin Awas Yojana, Livelihood Mission, and so there are a bunch of it. I mean, not bunch, but probably around 8 or 9. So, I mean, but do you think these schemes have not been able to meaningfully elevate the poverty by improving productivity, wages, and a long-term earning potential? But have they only, ensured the basic survival without addressing the root cause of the poverty? It's just like, giving them and letting them survive instead of getting out of it.
Yeah, absolutely right. So if you look at it, see what is really happening is that the government has been implementing some of these programs, to support the so you have this Garib Kalyan Yojana where you actually gave free food and all, uh,
Yeah,
outside of the Food Security Act, etc. During the COVID, you actually did that. You had a certain distribution of money to Kisan, so to farmers and stuff. So some of these things have been there, but the point is this, that you have about 82, 820, 810 kind of million people who are still being distributed free food, and that's a substantial portion of the population. Now, what is really happening is that if you look at the total consumption pattern, it does look like people are sort of starting to consume more of basic items such as cereals and stuff, and because the income shock happens, people are sort of drifted back into consuming basic items. And as you progress, you start consuming more of your diversification of consumption happens. It goes into services, it goes into discretionary spending, etc. So it does look like, in a context where the income growth in real terms, which has been roughly about 3.5%, net of the population growth will be just about 2.5%. The drifting down or a downgrading of consumption pattern has happened, and you have a significant increase, for instance, of consumption of cereals, etc. And you see, despite the fact that you have record high food grain production, you have double-digit inflation in cereals also. So this is basically telling us that the consumption of basic items is increasing. So that is one side, and it is actually given the context that you have high inflation as well, and there is a budgetary constant that is happening. So people are again drifting back into consuming basic items. So if you look at it, I was also looking at the employment data. What we found is that in the labor force, the young population, let's say from 15 to 30 years, 35 years, the proportion of labor force is actually decreasing. Until 45 as well, it is actually decreasing. So essentially, what is happening is that what might be happening is that in this whole budgetary constraint that is happening because of low income growth and the investment into education, upskilling, etc., may have been challenged. So this creates a sort of a intergenerational problem, because if you invest less in studies and upskilling, etc., your ability to earn better and then provide better for your children, etc., also gets challenged. So I think there is a serious issue out here. So I think there has to be policy sort of response to address this. And at this juncture, if you look at it, all the poverty alleviation program essentially are to address survival and subsistence.
But
You
actually
understand?
not taking it up.
So the thing is, it is something that happens through a certain act through the parliament. For instance, if you have a food security act, you necessarily need to sort of provide for food. So your dispatches, etc., of food and offtake, etc., will rise, and the government will need to commit more and more fiscal resources out there. The other thing that would happen is that the reliance on the government guarantee, employment guarantee would rise. So if you look at over the last 7, 8 years, it has consistently been rising. And notwithstanding the fact that the post-COVID recovery is supposed to have recovered till to the pre-COVID levels, the proportion, the growth in the number of people who are applying for Manrega has increased. The mandates that has been given that is there under Manrega is for the month of June or July. It is 44% higher than the same period, same month in 4 years back. So clearly, the government is through various acts and the responsibility that the government has. If there is lack of productive employment, etc., and there are issues with respect to poverty, there will be a higher reliance on government fiscal resources, and fiscal commitment will continue to rise.
Got it. So, sir, as we know that, like, yes, there are issues related to poverty, and the government have to do, uh, take many steps to elevate it. But there's also private players that plays an important role indirectly or directly in elevating such root cause in the economy. So, as in one of your article, you mentioned that the earning per share of the corporate has growth compared to pre-COVID level.
Yes.
But despite this, we have seen that capital expenditure remains low. So why do you think the corporates are reluctant to invest in capacity expansion, or even the government has taken steps like corporate tax rate cuts, higher FDI limits, digitization aims to, I mean, these all things probably moves towards the boosting private investments rather than declining. So what's the reason, and what are the factors driving this?
So we have studied. I mean, I have studied this for more than a decade, and I have sort of looked at a 360-degree perspective. I've taken a 360-degree perspective on the fact that analyzing the fact that private capex has been waning for more than a decade. I would say the last peak that we saw was 2011-12, and the robustness in the private capex has been lacking. I think there are multiple reasons. I would say, the thing is, the first of all, we had a lot of politicization of NPAs that happened earlier on. So the banks became very cagey and precautious about lending. They tightened credit standard, etc. And as a result of that, more and more NPAs happened in the banking system. Corporates also became very cautious, and it rolled into a sort of everlasting sort of uncertainty. So as a result of that, you had large NPAs, very conservative banks, and nobody wanted to take a decision. Nobody wanted to go ahead and spend. So I think that animal spirit somehow got killed. That's number one. Number two thing is that you've had multiple shocks, both exogenous, mostly exogenous shocks. I would say demonetization could be one of them. There could be there is also a sort of prolonged protectionism that has emanated post the GFC 2008, and then it intensified in 2019, where tariff wars happened, etc. So I think that's another contributor. Number three thing is that the demand side of households actually been coming off. So I think the fact that there is a lack of employment, which has persisted for a long time, there's a lack of demand, etc. So demand being very uncertain, corporates thought it would be, or may have thought that rather, in the context that you have a weak household demand, you rather import, or may you import and sort of sell it in the domestic market. It's easier. Plus that there are multiple, the cost of creating capacity, etc., and the return that you get out of investments that are actually been falling quite considerably. So the incentive for so the risk reward ratio for companies to invest, or manufacturing sector to invest, had actually come off quite a bit. So the government had actually taken a approach that if you sort of give incentives to companies and corporate private companies, they will be motivated to invest in capacity expansion. So you had tax cuts for corporates. In 2019 there was a massive cut in corporate tax rates. Then I think the government also tried to address the NPA issues through through various legal means, etc. They tried to dissolve all of the bankruptcy code was actually implemented, etc. So there are multiple things that were provided, and also the fact that over time the large companies gained market share, from the smaller unorganized players as more formalization happened. All these things benefited the formal sector, large companies, etc. And post the I would say the COVID shock, the larger companies gained even more. So you had large increase in commodity prices. Top line of companies surged quite a bit. There was a lot of liquidity that RBI provided, so interest rates were kept low, margins expanded, profit expanded exponentially. All those things accumulated over the last, let's say, 7, 8 years or more. But notwithstanding that, we find that the commitment of the corporate sector has not been that great as far as the private capex is concerned. The other thing that the government thought was that if they do a lot of investments in infrastructure, mainly in roads, railways, defense, and such things, ports, etc., you will be able to. They thought that it will be able to sort of crowd in private, etc. But what we find based on the data that has been released by RBI, so the government and RBI has been hoping that it will be around and turning around. And most people believe that it is just around the corner. But if you look at the granularity of the data that RBI has recently published, through the summation of the projects that have been approved by banks and financial institutions, we find that beyond some sectors such as roads, which is largely dependent on government capex, and also metals, which is essentially a function of global metal prices, and the fact that you had an episodic rise in profits for metal companies post-COVID. Beyond that, rest of the sectors, which is manufacturing sector, a whole host of manufacturing and services sector, there is hardly any growth. In fact, if you look at 3-year CAGR, the cost of projects that have been approved is actually 30% lower on a 3-year CAGR basis for rest of the sectors. So that tells us that it is lacking. So I would say, to summarize everything, I would say that the incentive for corporates to invest has all been loaded up. But I guess the volatility and the uncertainty with respect to demand scenario and the fact that we have mentioned, I just mentioned that I mentioned earlier that the income growth has for the household has been fairly weak. Employment situation has been fairly weak. The demand situation is very modest. If you look at the personal consumption expenditure in real terms, is in the second half of FY23 that grew at just about 2.5%. So if that kind of scenario is there as far as household demand is concerned, this is a very large portion of the total expenditure on the demand side. I would say that companies might still be very reluctant to do private capex, and global protectionism is increasing even more at this juncture. So I think all those things are something which is going to be fairly challenging from a from a structural growth standpoint and from private capex standpoint as well.
So I think it's more like a yes, a consumer spending plays an important role, and we have discussed that income has like not it's kind of decreased personal consumption expenditure, which has increased is also seen from the rich people, not from the lower middle income and the middle income. And the
Right.
second very important part, important thing is that I think the business confidence, the confidence of the corporate has actually not boost because of the so many shocks. It can be through like
Right.
external, internal, exogenous. So okay, so maybe next this decade can we see after now the shocks we expect the shocks to not come in near future, this coming in 5 6 years. And also since you mentioned that the it has been loaded with so many incentives and all, so do you think like we'll see next 5 to 6 years corporates coming out of this shocks and probably investing it more?
So we'll have to see. I think, see, the thing is, it's a very difficult scenario, and to answer your question is also sort of complicated. The thing is, do we have a recognition that there is a problem, especially at the household level? First, you need to recognize that. So if you have multiple government papers telling us that the problem is not there, the poverty has actually been eradicated, people are doing well, it may not really help. So first of all, you need to understand that or recognize that there is a problem. Number two, we have actually sort of create outlined a sort of a structure that might help actually. I would say that number one thing, see, while you have given a lot of incentive for companies to do capex, etc., and government has actually front loaded a lot of investments in roads, etc. What has happened on the other side is that indirect taxes has actually been rising, and the incidence of indirect taxes on household has actually been rising. So on the one side, your income growth is not that great, and you have a higher indirect tax incidence, their ability to spend also diminishes. So essentially, the government is trying to balance the fiscal burden of the supply side incentives that they're giving to the corporate sector for
The
crowding in,
Yeah.
and trying to balance this against increased indirect taxes. So what you need to do is to really reduce the indirect taxes in a significant way. So if you go back into history, from 1988, the indirect taxes, including custom duties and excise duty, sales tax, etc., all were brought down over a period of time. And I think after the liberalization, and then in 1990, 97, there were a whole host of easing of indirect taxes that happened. What it does is essentially to increase the ability of household to spend. As you spend and it becomes more predictable, that corporates might actually see better demand scenario. You might actually it may help people or companies to see resilience in demand, and that with a lag might translate into better confidence and better investment scenario. That's number one. I would say the other thing that we have mentioned is that you need to while you have done a lot of spending on infrastructure, etc., which is good, it will create a long-term supply side impulses. What you need to really do is to attack the low-hanging fruit. So the thing is, the primary thing that we need to address is the employment elasticity, which has been decreasing. So you need to sort of look at areas across sectors where you can incentivize such sectors which can actually employ more and more people. Remember that you have the informal and sector which has been impacted very adversely because of multiple shocks. So you need to really incentivize a lot of these services sectors which are low-hanging fruits which can be tapped into. There are multiple, you can actually take industrialization in the rural areas, maybe in the food processing industry, in the food industry, in logistics services, etc. Make it more formal, etc. That can actually create a lot of employment generation. And essentially, you need to create a more stable domestic demand scenario, and that can be only that can only happen if you sort of take some incentive, deploy some incentive with respect to indirect taxes and some of the direct sort of incentives you need to create for employment intensive sectors. And the way I look at future is that you might actually see much more adverse global scenario. You might actually see more protectionism panning out, especially because most of the developed economies are now burdened with very high level of debt.
Debt, yeah.
And of that they will sort of they will need to sort of rebalance that with higher taxes, etc. So I think the external impulses are not going to be very favorable. So while you might actually you might want to sort of carve out a certain arrangement with certain blocks in the Western world, what the government is trying to do with various in US and Europe and UK, etc. Through various arrangements, etc. But you need to focus a lot. I think that 90% of your focus should be on how to sort of resurrect your domestic demand scenario. How can you resurrect the household situation in India?
Got it. So in addition, also, sir, you talked about tax, that direct tax is also like quite high for because as we know, only few percent, 2.5 or 3% of people are paying taxes. So that burden is there, and also the high income tax, it also reduces the consumer spending capability of any individual. So now coming back to our last question, sir, that you mentioned that 60% of the public capital expenditure is done by government, is mainly into construction, and the second importantly administration. So in my perspective, I think I know that, like for example, construction of road and administration will give it benefits in a longer term. But considering our last 1 or 2 decades of administration in government organization, don't you think it's important uh, spending done on building up and for the better governance, the administration process and everything?
So I think, see, the thing is that I would say the government has done a lot of heavy lifting with respect to investments in roads, railways, ports, etc. I would say, yeah. So those are the areas that they have actually done. But the thing is that they have done a lot. I would say. I mean, there is a significant progress that has happened. I mean, these investments will create supply side impulses in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years time. It doesn't necessarily translate into a sort of a revival immediately, because a lot of these projects are now automated, and you give contracts of construction to private companies, construction companies, who gain out of these allocations. And then it sort of also helps certain segments such as cement and steel companies who would actually benefit. Since a lot of it is automated, it doesn't really diversify in terms of the multiplier effect
Multiplier
immediately.
effect, it has not such high multiplier effect compared to other
Those
investments.
30 years back, the government was into manufacturing. So I'm talking about 80s and all. The government was into manufacturing. So if the government had to were spending, and that time the government of the day was actually spending, and it had a significant multiplier effect on the private capex as well. So that's not happening now. Now, what you need is to really uh, allocate. So you need to sort of give use your fiscal instruments to improve the household spending capability or
Capability.
household income. It could be through tax reduction. For instance, if you have increased the indirect taxes through increasing the fuel fuel charges, taxes on fuel, for instance. It impacts the whole economy and everybody actually. So withdrawal of such things can be looked at. As I said, tax incentive for certain industries, etc., which can create employment, etc., can be done. And of course, till the time it sort of translates into real benefits, you will need to continue allocating towards the direct benefit schemes that you have through Manrega, employment generation, etc. All those things will need to sustain. So I think it will be a gradual progress, I would say, still, before you might actually see the private companies starting to sort of become more confident and start to invest in a significant way. So I think the structure that we are recommending eventually also benefits the companies or corporate sector through better demand scenario and a predictable cash flow scenario that will enable a sort of self-fulfilling virtuous cycle actually.
So it's like, so basically the problem is multidimensional from all aspects. The only thing
Yes.
is that we need to acknowledge those problems before we start solving it. This
Yes.
is what I infer from your all answers. Hopefully, we acknowledge one day and we'll move in that direction. So thank you so much, sir, for this insightful conversation. And it was really enlightening, and it was heavily on the numbers and technical side. So I think the audience will understand and probably have their own views on that. So thank you so much.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.